It was supposed to be an ordinary night, the kind that fades quietly into memory without leaving a trace. The streets were calm, lights glowing softly behind drawn curtains, and most of the city was already asleep. But somewhere in that silence, something went terribly wrong. By the time the sun rose the next morning, investigators would be standing at a crime scene so disturbing, so carefully concealed and yet so brutally honest, that even seasoned professionals would struggle to make sense of what they were seeing. This was not a crime of impulse. It was not loud, fast, or careless. It was deliberate, patient, and chillingly precise. The victim was found in a place that should have felt safe. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered windows, no desperate screams reported by neighbors. At first glance, the room almost looked untouched, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But as investigators moved closer, the truth revealed itself piece by piece. Every detail told a story, and every story raised more questions than answers. It was immediately clear that whoever was responsible had planned this moment long before it ever happened. The body had been positioned carefully, not randomly discarded or hidden in panic. This alone sent a wave of unease through the investigators. Crimes like this often reveal the mind of the person behind them, and this mind was disturbingly controlled. There was no chaos here, no frantic attempt to escape responsibility. Instead, there was intention, silence, time. As forensic teams began their work, they noticed something even more unsettling. Certain items were missing, but not the ones most people would expect. Valuables were left behind, untouched, while objects with no obvious monetary value had vanished. This ruled out a robbery almost instantly. The motive was something else entirely, something personal, the kind of motive that doesn't fade with time, but grows stronger. Detectives started digging into the victim's life, believing that the answers would be found there. On the surface, everything seemed normal. A steady routine, familiar faces, no known enemies. But as they pushed deeper, cracks began to show. Conversations that once seemed harmless now carried weight. Small disagreements took on new meaning. People who were once dismissed as irrelevant suddenly became important. One of the most disturbing realizations was how close the perpetrator may have been. There were no signs of a struggle near the entrance, suggesting the victim may have willingly let someone inside. This single detail shifted the entire direction of the investigation. Trust had been involved, and that made the betrayal far more chilling. Someone known, someone familiar, someone who didn't raise suspicion until it was far too late. As hours turned into days, pressure mounted, media attention grew, and with it, public fear. People wanted answers. How could something this calculated happen without anyone noticing? How could someone commit such a gruesome act and vanish without a trace? Every lead seemed promising at first, only to collapse under closer inspection. Forensic evidence painted a partial picture, but not a complete one. Traces were present, but they were minimal, almost as if the scene had been cleaned with care. This wasn't the work of someone inexperienced. Investigators began to believe they were dealing with someone who understood how evidence worked, or at least understood how to avoid leaving too much behind. That realization sent a chill through the entire department. Interviews with friends and colleagues revealed subtle shifts in behavior in the days leading up to the crime. A strange phone call, a sudden argument, a meeting that no one could fully explain. None of these details meant much on their own, but together they formed a pattern, and patterns are where the truth often hides. One witness recalled seeing a familiar figure near the location that night, someone who had every reason to be there and none at all. At the time it didn't seem suspicious. Now, it felt impossible to ignore. Detectives revisited old statements, replayed recorded interviews, and re-examined timelines. Slowly, almost painfully, the case began to breathe. But just as investigators felt they were closing in, the case took another dark turn. New evidence emerged that contradicted their leading theory. The timeline no longer fit. A person of interest suddenly had an alibi that couldn't be easily dismissed. Doubt crept back in, heavier than before. The room that once seemed to whisper answers now felt silent again. What made this case truly horrifying wasn't just the brutality of the act itself, but the emotional weight it carried. This was not violence for attention or chaos. It was personal, controlled, purposeful, and whoever did this had managed to blend back into normal life, at least for now, while investigators chased shadows. As days stretched into weeks, frustration grew. The crime refused to be simplified. Every answer created new questions, and every step forward was followed by 2 steps back. Yet one thing remained clear. This case was far from over. Somewhere within the evidence, within the silence, the truth was waiting. And when it finally surfaced, it would shock everyone who thought they understood what had really happened that night. As the investigation dragged on, the weight of the unanswered questions began to take its toll. Detectives were no longer just chasing evidence. They were chasing a mindset. They knew that understanding how the crime happened was not enough. They had to understand why, and that why was buried deep beneath layers of secrecy, emotion, and long-held resentment. A breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A detail that had once seemed insignificant suddenly stood out when viewed through a different lens. It was a routine action, something so ordinary that no one thought to question it at first. But when investigators aligned it with the timeline, everything shifted. The window of opportunity narrowed, and the list of possible suspects grew smaller. Attention turned towards someone who had remained just outside the spotlight. This person had been cooperative, calm, and consistent from the beginning. Too consistent. Their statements never changed, even when new information surfaced. To experienced investigators, this raised concern. Genuine memories often contain small contradictions. Perfect stories rarely do. Surveillance footage from nearby locations was reviewed again, frame by frame. What initially looked like nothing became something. A movement, a pause, a figure lingering just a little too long. The image was unclear, but the behavior was not. It suggested hesitation, as if the person was waiting for the right moment, or perhaps gathering the courage to do something irreversible. When confronted with the growing evidence, the suspect's demeanor began to crack. Small changes in body language, delayed responses, and emotional reactions that didn't match the situation all hinted at something deeper. Investigators pressed harder, not with accusations but with silence, and in that silence, the truth started to slip through. The confession, when it finally came, was not dramatic. There were no raised voices or emotional outbursts. It was quiet, flat, almost mechanical. The details were delivered as if the person were describing someone else's actions, not their own. This emotional distance only made the story more unsettling. The motive was revealed slowly, piece by piece. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It was about control and unresolved anger that had been building for years. What began as resentment turned into obsession, and obsession eventually demanded action. The crime was not spontaneous. It was rehearsed mentally over and over again, until the line between thought and action disappeared. Investigators learned that the perpetrator had blended into everyday life with alarming ease. Friends described them as quiet, dependable, unremarkable, and that was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all. There were no obvious warning signs, no dramatic changes, no outward signs of danger. The threat had been hiding in plain sight. Reconstructing the final moments was difficult, even for professionals. The level of deception involved required a deep understanding of trust. The victim never saw it coming. There was no time to react, no chance to escape. That realization weighed heavily on everyone involved in the case. When the case finally went to trial, the courtroom was filled with tension. The evidence spoke clearly, but the emotional impact lingered long after each detail was presented. This was not just a story of crime, but of human failure, of emotions left unchecked, and of consequences that could never be undone. In the end, justice came in the form of accountability, but it did not bring closure in the way many had hoped. The loss remained. The questions lingered, and the haunting realization settled in that sometimes the most terrifying crimes are committed not by strangers in the dark, but by people we think we know. This case left investigators changed. It reminded them that evil does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits patiently, hidden behind routine and familiarity, and when it finally reveals itself, the shock is not just in what was done, but in who was capable of doing it. Long after the evidence was filed away, and the headlines faded, the echoes of this crime continued to linger. A reminder that the darkest truths often lie beneath the calmest surfaces, and that understanding them requires looking beyond what feels comfortable. Because in cases like this, the real horror is not just the act itself, but the quiet realization that it could happen again anywhere at any time.